Okay, hi guys. I am just doing the video lecture capture for you so you can watch these slides and hear my voice and have instruction along with the slides. And I'm going to have some questions inserted throughout that you can answer before you proceed to the next set of slides in this one PowerPoint. Okay, so I'm going to put it on presentation mode. Hopefully this works. Okay, so this is the endocrine system, including hormones and their actions. So the endocrine system and the nervous system together, so the brain, the spinal cord, and all the nerves, along with all the endocrine organs, some of which are in the brain, the thyroid gland, the pancreas, the spleen, some of the GI organs, and then the gonads, like the ovaries and the testes. Those are all part of the endocrine system. They do a whole bunch of things, specifically releasing key hormones that regulate body function. Everything from growth, development, reproduction, sleep, circadian rhythms, all of those hormones work together to balance your body. And the other side of that is your nervous system. So the nervous system is also the major integrator and allows you to take in stimuli through your brain and your eyes, and then it exerts effects through nerves in your entire body. So really the two of these, the nervous system and the endocrine system, work together to maintain homeostasis. Okay, for all the different organ systems of your body, the skeletal systems, your bones, integumentary, your skin, reproductive system, respiratory system, cardiovascular, heart, blood vessels and blood, urinary system, digestive and muscular. All of those are regulated by these two overall kind of overarching control systems. And they're different. They work together, but they're also different. So the brain, through the spinal cord, regulates the release of all kinds of different processes and hormones, things like norepinephrine and epinephrine being released by your adrenal glands. That has some control happening through your nervous system. And then your endocrine system, which happens through the hypothalamus of the brain and the pituitary of the brain. Those release hormones that exert control over various organs of your body, like your thyroid, adrenal cortex, again, shown here, and, for example, gonads, like the testes, shown here. So the point is all of these kind of integrate and work together in different ways to maintain your homeostasis of your entire body. The endocrine glands are shown here. Here's the brain in a sagittal section. Here's the hypothalamus. It's this triangular sort of region right here at the base of the brain, or the ventral side of the brain, underside of the brain. The pituitary gland that hangs down from the hypothalamus. The pineal gland, which is back here, and that has really important roles in circadian rhythms and sleep, as we'll talk about at the end of these slides. We have the thyroid gland. That's a butterfly-shaped gland, goes around the front of the trachea. The adrenal glands that sit on top of the kidneys. The pancreas that's right behind the stomach. The gonads, in the case of ovaries for a female, testes for a male. And here's a blow up of some cells, a microscope image showing some of the cells of the pancreas. And these are specifically involved in blood sugar regulation. And that's what we are going to be doing in tests in lab on Thursday.
Okay. In this example, dehydration is detected.
Let me rewind that. Okay, this is a little video that gives a good overview of the endocrine system.
Hormonal communication generally begins with a part of the neuroendocrine system receiving sensory information and reacting by issuing a command to the body in the form of a hormone. In this example, dehydration is detected by osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus, which then directs or stimulates the posterior pituitary gland to release antidiuretic hormone, ADH. The next step is to transport the hormone molecules to target cells. This is typically done via the bloodstream. Here, ADH is transported through the bloodstream to the kidneys and blood vessels. When hormone molecules reach target cells, they will bind to matching receptors on those cells, and the hormone receptor complexes will trigger changes in the target cells. This causes the kidneys to reduce the urine volume output, thereby increasing water retention and countering dehydration. In blood vessels, vasoconstriction is increased, leading to higher blood pressure and thus countering the blood pressure drop caused by dehydration.
Okay, so that seems a little bit complicated, but really it's sort of showing how the endocrine system, in combination with the nervous system, and actually the brain as involved is referred to as the neuroendocrine system, because the hypothalamus and the pituitary start this cascade of events. But all that is to sort of demonstrate all of these complex stimuli are detected by the endocrine system and the neuroendocrine system, or the brain, and they mediate a response. So they release hormones that have an effect on various target organs and cells of the body to actually fix that problem or adjust to that situation as part of homeostasis. So let's see if it won't let me go further. So I'll have to skip ahead manually. Okay, so hormones are really classified as several different types, but to keep it simple, they're classified into sort of two major categories: amino acid or protein-based hormones, or steroids, lipid-based hormones. The steroids, of course, like we've talked about, are derived from cholesterol. So basic hormone action involves it circulating, being dumped into the blood, so it gets captured by blood vessels, capillaries, and then it circulates throughout the body through the blood. That's kind of the definition of a hormone. And then it influences specific tissues or target cells. So those are cells that actually have the specific receptor for the specific hormone. Not all cells have the proper receptor for a given hormone, okay? And a hormone can actually have different effects on different target cells. So some of those receptors lead to different downstream responses or different behaviors in those cells. An example, I have a little cartoon shown here. Here's an endocrine cell secreting a specific hormone, these little purple diamonds. Here's a target cell. It actually has the proper receptor that fits in shape and conformation to that particular hormone. This cell right here does not have that particular receptor, so it is not going to be able to respond or change its behavior in response to that hormone because it doesn't have the receptor. So these are sort of the basics of the endocrine system. What is a hormone? It travels in the blood. It's a molecule, whether it's a protein or fat-based molecule that travels in the blood. It acts on target cells, and the target cells have to have the specific receptor for that hormone. That's what makes them a target. There are various different signaling within the body, chemical signaling between cells within your body. There's paracrine signaling, where local neighbor cells release factors or molecules, and those affect adjacent cells that are kind of nearby. This relies on diffusion. So the molecules diffuse a short distance, and then they act on those specific cells. We call that paracrine. Those are like local signaling effects. Like blood clotting would be an example of paracrine factors, local signaling effects that change processes. Synaptic signaling is like through the nervous system. You have a neuron that comes down through a nerve, and it releases neurotransmitters on, for example, a muscle, like one of your skeletal muscle fibers, and this allows muscle contraction. That is known as synaptic signaling, and it happens primarily through the nervous system. The third of these, and the one we're focusing on here, is endocrine signaling, and that's where endocrine cells make a specific hormone, and they release it into the blood. Over here, they release their specific hormone they make into the blood. It gets carried in the blood, and then it diffuses and acts on the specific target cells which have the receptors for that hormone. But there are also classifications by hormone action. So according to how they act or where they act, we can classify hormones as polar. So if you remember that, polar means they have a polarity to them. They have charge, or they're polar in nature. So that means they're water soluble. They diffuse in water. They cannot pass through the plasma membrane because the plasma membrane is a fat. It's made of phospholipids and cholesterol. So they actually act on receptors on the plasma membrane. There is a receptor, there's a signaling molecule or a hormone that's polar. It acts on the receptor. This receptor actually triggers a whole pathway of other proteins and mediators that carry out that response and allow that cell to change its behavior or to do something in response to receiving that hormone signal. Okay, so if these are used as drugs, for example, in any kind of treatment, if there is a polar hormone, it has to be injected directly into the blood. because it's not going to diffuse through the cells of your gut and get into your blood. This includes all the polypeptide hormones, the glycoprotein hormones, catecholamines, which are derivatives of a specific amino acid, and these are known as the famous norepinephrine, epinephrine, dopamine, etc. And this is known as, adrenaline and noradrenaline. We'll come back to these more later. The other type of hormone classified by how it acts are the nonpolar category. These are insoluble in water, so these are lipid-based. They're often called lipophilic hormones. This was on our exam. This term lipophilic means lipid-loving, right? So it merges with other lipids. They can enter the target cells directly, so the receptor is actually inside the cell, okay? So for these, they can enter something like a lipid-soluble hormone like testosterone can enter or diffuse right through the plasma membrane because it's small and it's a lipid. So their receptors are going to be inside the cell. There's no reason to have them on the outside in the membrane and then have it trigger a whole pathway inside the cell, because it can actually diffuse right through and bind to its intracellular receptor inside the cell. So these include the steroids that we've talked a bit about, thyroid hormones that we've mentioned in metabolism, and we're coming back to now. Melatonin and aldosterone are just a few of the major nonpolar hormones. These, if they're taken as a drug or given medically as a drug, they can be taken orally in pill form, because these are going to be able to diffuse right through the plasma membrane of the cells that line your gut. And so you'll be able to just take these right in a pill if they're given clinically. So just to sort of recap, cell signaling involves a cell responding to a given signal. Okay, so cell signaling. This is the plasma membrane. In this example, this is one of the protein or amino acid-based hormones. It acts on a receptor that's in the plasma membrane. This triggers a whole cascade of events where one protein or relay molecule activates another one, and so on until there's a downstream cellular response. Examples of responses are changes in motility, starting to express new genes, new proteins are being made. The cell begins to divide or undergo mitosis. Those are examples of responses that a particular protein hormone can trigger through this cell signaling pathway. There are whole classes dedicated to just cell signaling or cell signal transduction pathways. Believe it or not, your cells have thousands of these pathways, like cobwebs, that they use in response to various molecules. So I just want you to sort of see where the receptor is. In the case of a protein or an amino acid-based hormone, the receptor is going to be in the plasma membrane. Because remember, something polar cannot get through a non-polar barrier. The transduction is going to occur inside of the cell. So this is this relay. Sorry, there's a dog barking outside. So it triggers this whole cascade or transduction of the signal inside of the cell to activate the downstream responses. And the responses, of course, are inside of the cell, and the cell actually does something or changes its behavior or processes.
Aldosterone.
Oops, sorry, that cuts in quick. There's a nice, another little video that shows an example of a hormone, aldosterone, that acts inside of cells. So instead of acting on a receptor on the plasma membrane, it actually is lipid soluble or lipophilic, so it can just enter directly. Here's that short animation.
Is a lipid-soluble hormone that can easily diffuse through the plasma membrane.
Aldosterone.
Inside the cell, aldosterone binds with an aldosterone receptor molecule in the cytoplasm. The aldosterone receptor complex moves into the nucleus and binds to DNA. The binding of the aldosterone receptor complex to DNA stimulates the synthesis of messenger RNA,
so that's
which codes
transcription
for specific proteins. The messenger RNA moves from the nucleus into the cytoplasm and binds to ribosomes, where it directs the synthesis of specific proteins. These proteins produce the response of the cell to aldosterone.
Okay, so the ribosomes with the mRNA are the copy of the gene coming from the nucleus, and then the newly made polypeptide or the protein. This is one example of how a lipophilic hormone like aldosterone, which we'll look at in a few minutes, can actually enter into the cell, act on its intracellular receptor, and then it leads to a response in the cell. And the response in this case is that it creates, or the gene gets expressed and makes this newly made protein. So that is one example of how a lipophilic hormone acts on a receptor inside of the cell. Okay, so hormones that bind to these nuclear receptors, they're called lipophilic steroid hormones. Other examples are the thyroid hormones, T3 and T4, and we'll talk about those in a little bit. And these travel to target cells using carrier proteins, okay, because they don't like water. They're non-polar, so they're really going to aggregate away from water in the blood plasma. So they actually need specific carrier proteins, or like holders, little nurse holder proteins that help transport them in the blood to their target cells. So when they reach the target cells, they actually get close enough up to their cells and they dissociate from their carrier proteins. So they sort of diffuse over to their cells and they diffuse across the plasma membrane. They act on receptors that are inside the cell. So these are known as nuclear hormone receptors because they're actually in the nucleus, and the hormone can traverse all the way through the membrane and get into the nucleus and then act on their specific receptors. And what they do is they activate gene transcription. So they sit on the DNA, they bind to it, and they allow gene expression. So they turn on a gene and allow the expression of a protein that comes specifically from that gene or genes. Here's an example of a mechanism of steroid hormone action. Again, these are non-polar, so they're carried in a carrier protein throughout the blood. They get nearby in proximity to their target cell, shown here, this big square, and they can diffuse right across the plasma membrane. In this case, they're acting on a receptor that's inside the cell, and then it translocates into the nucleus where it then sits on the DNA. It binds to specific sequences on genes that are on the DNA, and then that can lead to the expression of new mRNA, messenger RNA that comes from that specific gene, which leaves the nucleus, gets translated into new proteins, and then that carries out the hormone response, the steroid hormone response. And some of these receptors are in the nucleus and some of these are in the cytoplasm, depending on the hormone. But just suffice it to say they act on an intracellular or nuclear hormone receptor. And shown in this process in a little bit more detail, there's a binding domain that the steroid binds to, and then there's a DNA binding domain, all part of this steroid hormone receptor. So like estrogen and testosterone will act on receptors just like this. They will actually bind to specific sequences of DNA. So remember the ATCG, those combinations. They will bind to very specific sequences known as hormone response elements that are right next to the target gene. And what they'll do is they'll bind onto or sit right on that sequence, and that will trigger all the enzymes to come onto the DNA and allow the gene expression or transcription of that sequence of DNA or that gene, leading to mRNA and then downstream leading to protein. So this is what leads to new proteins being expressed when a cell is exposed to very specific steroid hormones. And we know that there are actually a lot of these hormone response elements at different locations along the DNA, along the chromosomes. Dozens, for example, that respond to things like testosterone and estrogen. So they lead to the production of numerous new mRNA and protein being made.
Steroid hormones are not water soluble. They travel in the blood attached to protein carriers. When steroid hormones arrive at their target cells, they dissociate from their protein carriers and pass through the plasma membrane of the cell. Some steroid hormones bind to specific receptor proteins in the cytoplasm and then move as a hormone receptor complex into the nucleus. Other steroids travel directly into the nucleus before encountering their receptor proteins, not shown.
So
the hormone receptor protein, activated by binding to the hormone, is now able to bind to specific regions of the DNA.
Hormone response
These
element.
DNA regions are known as the hormone response elements. The binding of the hormone receptor complex has a direct effect on the level of transcription at that site. Messenger RNA, mRNA, is produced, which then codes for the synthesis of specific proteins.
Okay, again, so another example of how these are acting, how they're being carried by carriers in the blood and then acting intracellularly to change gene expression and lead to the production of brand new proteins in response to that steroid. All right, so that's kind of an overview of the endocrine system and the nervous system, and then how the different types of hormones, polar and non-polar hormones, act in their signaling pathways. Now we're going to survey the different endocrine glands or organs. First, starting with the pituitary gland. So this one is really, really important, and it is attached to sort of the base of the brain, attached to the hypothalamus. One of my students took this image, and I really like it. This is a part of half of the pituitary gland, the posterior pituitary, and this is the other half, the anterior pituitary, just a segment under the microscope. So the pituitary gland, as I mentioned, is attached to the hypothalamus by a pituitary stalk. It's divided into the anterior and posterior lobe. You don't have to know the fancy names. The anterior pituitary is located on the anterior side, so closest to the face. The posterior pituitary is near the back of the head in that direction, but they both are connected directly to the hypothalamus. So here's an enlarged view of that. Here's the hypothalamus. It contains a lot of neurons that branch down and also create different hormones that affect the anterior and posterior pituitary. So these two anatomically are directly connected. Posterior pituitary, anterior pituitary, and hypothalamus. And as we'll see, the hypothalamus is the boss in this whole situation. Okay, so here's the hypothalamus, and then the posterior and anterior pituitary. This is really, really important because this neuroendocrine gland, the hypothalamus, controls these two structures, the posterior and anterior pituitary, and they actually produce a bunch of hormones, that affect multiple tissues in your body. So they make hormones known as prolactin, growth hormone, FSH and LH. We'll look at those more. They regulate reproduction and puberty. ACTH and TSH that affects the thyroid. So these are all specifically coming from the anterior pituitary in response to what the hypothalamus is telling the anterior pituitary to do. The posterior pituitary actually has hormones that are made up in the hypothalamus, but that are released from the posterior pituitary, and we'll look at those individually. So the anterior pituitary, or lobe of the pituitary, makes trophic hormones. Okay, trophic hormones are hormones that stimulate hormone secretion in other glands. So they actually have a trophic effect. They cause other target cells to actually start dumping out other hormones. So it creates a whole series of hormone cascades. And this is what regulates a lot of the overall physiology of your body. So the anterior pituitary hormones are, as I mentioned on the previous slide, growth hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH, adreno, this stimulates the adrenal glands, follicle stimulating hormone, or FSH, luteinizing hormone, or LH, and prolactin, or PRL. Lactin, this refers to like lactose. This is prolactose, so this is involved in milk production of the mammary glands. We'll talk more about those as well. These go through the anterior pituitary hormones, all their names, the target tissue, so what tissue or organ or gland do they act on, and then their overall actions, and then how their secretion is regulated. So I just want to sort of mention, look at the target tissues for each of these. ACTH acts on the adrenals. TSH acts on the thyroid gland. Growth hormone acts on most of the tissue, bone, muscle, fat, protein of your body. And so growth hormone has widespread effects on various target tissues and cells. Follicle stimulating hormone acts on the gonads, testes, and ovaries. Prolactin acts on the mammary glands and other sex accessory organs, so reproductive organs. And LH, or luteinizing hormone, acts again on the gonads, like FSH. Those two are kind of the main reproductive anterior pituitary hormones. And now look over here, it says regulation of secretion. So these anterior pituitary hormones are all specifically regulated by different hormones that have similar names, but these are all coming from the hypothalamus. And we're going to look at those in a minute. The hypothalamus is actually the boss. It puts out either releasing or inhibiting hormones that either stimulate or stop the release of these anterior pituitary hormones. So it's like the hypothalamus is controlling what the anterior lobe of the pituitary is doing. This gives a really nice summary in these slides of what these hormones specifically do, their target organs and the effects, and then what were to happen if you have hyposecretion or not enough secretion, or hypersecretion, too much secretion of each of these different anterior pituitary hormones. So growth hormone affects liver, muscle, bone, cartilage, many other tissues. It stimulates protein synthesis and somatic growth. That just means body growth. And it mobilizes fats, so releases fats, and increases blood glucose levels. So it really allows a lot of your tissues to grow and get larger in size and put down new protein and new material. Allows you to grow. Now notice, if you don't have enough as a child, this can result in pituitary dwarfism because there's a reduction in growth hormone. And this is something that we see. It's relatively, it's not very common, but we do see this. Also, too much of growth hormone as a child will result in gigantism. Okay, so giants. If the exposure levels are very high, often due to a tumor in the anterior pituitary that secretes growth hormone, it leads to acromegaly in adults, which is kind of disproportionate in very large bones and structures of the body. So we also have thyroid stimulating hormone that stimulates the thyroid gland. There's several of these effects that happen when you don't have enough thyroid hormones or when you have too much. And we're going to go through these later when we get to the thyroid gland. Adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH, that affects the adrenal cortex. It promotes the release of very specific hormones, and there are a couple of diseases that result from not enough. Addison's disease is one of those we'll talk about, and too much adrenocorticotropic hormone, and that results in Cushing's disease, and we'll talk more about that at the end. We also have follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. These are both gonadotropes. That means they have trophic or stimulatory effects on the gonads, gonadotroph. These affect the testes and the ovaries. They stimulate ovarian follicle or egg maturation and the production of estrogen. And in males, they stimulate sperm production. Now notice, if you don't have enough FSH, the individual will fail to undergo sexual maturation, so will not enter puberty and will not be fertile. And luteinizing hormone is pretty much very similar effects, and the individual won't undergo sexual maturation, will have infertility issues if they do not have LH. Notice these are just two hormones coming from the pituitary, and they can completely cease the reproductive system and cause infertility. Something interesting also about LH, and we'll talk about this more in the menstrual cycle, is that in females it triggers ovulation and stimulates the production of estrogen and progesterone. And in males, it promotes testosterone production. So LH is really, really important for maintaining the hormonal balance in females and males, and actually in triggering ovulation from the ovary in females. Prolactin, as I mentioned, it affects the secretory tissue of the breast, so the lobules that produce milk, and it promotes lactation or milk production. So when you don't have enough, when a woman doesn't have enough prolactin, for example, after labor and delivery, she would have poor milk production. And if there's too much prolactin, it'll actually result in inappropriate milk production, or something called galactorrhea, for galactose, rhea, too much production of that. And then cessation of menses, or the stopping of the menstrual cycle in females. If there's too much... Sorry, if there's too much, that's my son. If there's too much of it, it'll stop menstruation in females. And actually, if there's too much prolactin in males, it leads to impotence and fertility problems. Okay, so the posterior pituitary stores and releases two hormones made in the hypothalamus. So these are actually made in the hypothalamus and just released down from the posterior pituitary. And those are antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. And both of these are really important. ADH is actually involved in the retention of water by the kidneys, so their role in water balance. It's also called arginine vasopressin, but ADH I like better because it really describes what it does. Antidiuretic hormone means don't have a diuresis or loss of water. So it prevents the loss of water from the kidneys. When you're dehydrated, this is being secreted in abundance from your posterior pituitary. Oxytocin is involved in stimulating contractions of the uterus during childbirth and delivery. And it's also involved in the contraction of muscle of the breast tissue. So it's involved in milk release in lactation or nursing. So these are produced in the hypothalamus, transported along axons, which is the long process coming from those neurons, and then they reach the posterior pituitary where they're stored, and then they're released when the right stimuli is detected. So their release is controlled by neuroendocrine reflexes, basically neural and endocrine reflexes that are coming from stimuli in the body. So ADH is stimulated by an increase in blood tonicity or blood concentration. So if the number of solutes or the amount of salt or stuff goes up in the blood, or inversely, blood plasma or fluid goes down, so it makes the blood more tonic or more concentrated, that stimulates the release of ADH. It also triggers thirst, as we saw in that opening endocrine video. Oxytocin is stimulated by suckling and touch. So specifically in nursing, it's stimulated by the suckling of the infant on the breast. I will say also other stimuli such as hearing, like auditory cues of a woman hearing a baby crying, even if the baby's not her own, can actually trigger the neuroendocrine reflex that'll cause a dumping out of oxytocin. And it can actually cause milk letdown and release of milk from the breast just upon hearing another baby crying. So it can be an embarrassing thing. It happens. It's part of the neuroendocrine reflex that regulates oxytocin release from the posterior pituitary. So again, the ADH is antidiuretic hormone. The target is the kidneys, and it allows them to resorb water, preventing a diuresis or loss of water in the pee. So if you're dehydrated, if your blood is saltier or you have less fluid in your plasma, your brain sends this hormonal signal saying, do not pee. Hang on to the water because we can't afford to lose any more. So antidiuretic hormone. It also allows you to be very thirsty, or causes you to be very thirsty, and triggers you to want to drink a lot of water. Again, oxytocin induces smooth muscle contraction of the reproductive organs and is involved in milk ejection during breastfeeding, again, responding to suckling or auditory cues. And it signals also the contraction of the uterus during childbirth. So oxytocin is what actually helps to trigger the onset of childbirth, with strong contractions of the uterus that build and build over time. We'll talk about pregnancy later in the course and childbirth. A lot of fun. So it's also some other things. Your book doesn't talk about a whole lot, but I will talk about this more later in the course as well. Oxytocin is actually released during orgasm, touch, closeness between two people, has roles in bonding, connectedness, and love. And we're going to talk more on this later when we talk about the biology and evolution of sex and love a couple weeks down the road in the course. So that's a lot of fun. So here's the hypothalamic control of the posterior pituitary. We've got ADH and oxytocin, those key kind of childbirth and nursing hormone and water conserving hormone that are made in the hypothalamus by specific neuroendocrine neurons. They're made there, and then they're traveled, they carry down, and they're stored at the ends of these neurons, which are positioned right in the posterior pituitary. Then when the proper stimuli are detected, they are dumped into the blood, the veins, the blood vessels that surround the posterior pituitary. So they're dumped in the blood, and then they get carried out to the rest of the body where they reach the target cells. So the hypothalamus controls the anterior pituitary by actually releasing hormones. Here's specific neurons that make key hormones in the hypothalamus, and they release those hormones into the little blood vessels that go down to the anterior pituitary and surround the cells that are in the anterior pituitary. So the hypothalamus makes releasing and inhibiting hormones, and they are secreted into the blood system that carries down to the anterior pituitary and then affects the release of those cells to either stimulate and release their specific hormone or not. So the hypothalamus is the boss, and it's controlling the release of specific hormones from the anterior lobe of the pituitary. So it's a neuroendocrine organ, and it's the boss. Okay, so these releasing and inhibiting hormones are coming specifically from the hypothalamus due to various stimuli that come into the brain, that your brain detects, integrates, makes sense of, and then causes the release of either one of these releasing or one of these inhibiting hormones. And they go down and travel through the little blood vessels and affect the anterior pituitary. The releasing and inhibiting hormones are all of these. I know they have a lot of hairy names, but they're related specifically to the anterior pituitary hormone that they trigger the release of or they inhibit. Corticotropin releasing hormone, or CRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone, or GnRH. Gonadotropins that we spoke about already are FSH and LH. So this one controls the release of FSH and LH. Prolactin inhibiting hormones. So this does exactly what its name describes. It inhibits the release of prolactin. It's also dopamine. It's known as dopamine, which is one of the areas in the brain where we find dopamine. And this is how it acts as a hormone here to stop the release of prolactin. We have somatostatin, which has effects on growth hormone. Thyrotropin releasing hormone, thyrotropin, causes the release of thyroid stimulating hormone that comes from the anterior pituitary, which ultimately affects the thyroid. And then we also have growth hormone releasing hormone. This does exactly what it sounds like. It causes the release of growth hormone from the anterior pituitary. Those are all the hypothalamic hormones. Their overall structure, just how many amino acids. I don't care that you know that. And then the effect on the anterior pituitary. What do they actually trigger in the anterior pituitary? So notice prolactin inhibiting hormone inhibits prolactin secretion. Growth hormone releasing hormone stimulates growth hormone secretion. Somatostatin inhibits secretion of growth hormone. So this is when it gets secreted from the hypothalamus, tells the anterior pituitary, nope, don't secrete any growth hormone. We're good. We've grown. We don't have enough reserve. We're not going to do that right now. And then notice back up here, gonadotropin releasing hormone, or GnRH, stimulates the secretion of FSH and LH. These are what regulate the reproductive cycle and fertility in men and women. And these come from the GnRH, which is made and secreted by the hypothalamus. All right, so all of these are actually the final product that's made in these hypothalamus, pituitary, downstream endocrine gland pathway. The downstream hormone that's released has an effect on the secretion of the pituitary hormones. So basically, it feeds back and inhibits the pituitary from secreting more of that original hormone. These cycles occur in a negative feedback pathway or negative feedback inhibition. These help to prevent over secretion of key hormones and to keep the endocrine system in balance or in homeostasis. So inhibition from the downstream, from the final hormone in the pathway, can feedback and inhibit at the level of the pituitary in responding to the hypothalamic hormones, those controlling hypothalamic hormones, or the inhibition can occur at the actual hypothalamus level, inhibiting the secretion of those releasing hypothalamic hormones. And so we'll look at this visually just to see what this looks like. Here's the hypothalamus, here's the anterior pituitary, and here's the downstream target or gland. In this situation is the gonad, like the testes and the ovaries. The hypothalamus, if it gets the right triggers, it will release gonadotropin releasing hormone, or GnRH. That causes the anterior pituitary cells, the specific cells that make FSH and LH, it'll cause them to start dumping out or secreting FSH and LH. Those will target the gonads and affect the cells of the gonads and allow them to start dumping out sex steroid hormones like estrogens and androgens. Now notice these final product hormones in this hormonal cascade, which started at the hypothalamus, went to the pituitary, and then down to the gonads. These hormones actually travel through the blood and they negatively feed back. So it's a negative feedback inhibition where they stop the anterior pituitary cells from being able to respond to any more GnRH. And if these levels are high enough, it'll have that negative feedback inhibition, not just at the level of the pituitary, but also at the level of the brain or the hypothalamus. It'll stop the hypothalamus from actually releasing more GnRH. Now, if you could think about this for a minute, it's a cycle. It's a way to shut off the faucet, right? If you're releasing a bunch of hormones, you have enough estrogen, you have enough androgen, and everything is happening, the gametes are developing, the body tissues are responding, everything's good, but you have high amounts of these. This serves to shut off the faucet. You don't need any more if you have enough of that end product already made. This serves to act in a homeostasis sort of pathway, whereas if you have enough of these particular downstream hormones, it'll shut off the production of more, at least for a period of time. And so these typically occur in cycles. They go up and down and up and down because we have this negative feedback inhibition going on at the level of the brain and the anterior pituitary. And this happens for all of the hormones that we just went through, all the different anterior pituitary hormones that were in the previous slides. So there's a lot of higher brain control. As I said, the brain receives the stimuli and integrates everything that's going on around you and everything that your body and yourself you're exposed to. So the hypothalamus receives input from a whole bunch of higher brain regions, including the cortex of your brain, which is the outermost tissue of your brain, responsible for emotions, higher thinking, memory, cognition, recalling, speaking, language, all of those things. And your emotions are in that cortical region of your brain, and these actually can alter hormone secretion because they affect your hypothalamus. All of these stimuli basically get routed to and affect the ventral aspect of the brain of the hypothalamus. And so far, about 26 different or more brain regions and olfactory neurons, so smell neurons coming from your nose, actually send their neuron axons to the GnRH producing neurons of your hypothalamus. So remember, again, these are gonadotropin releasing hormones that control the release of the gonadotrophic hormones, FSH and LH, from the pituitary, which control reproduction and the production of gametes and sexual reproduction. So this is showing that a lot of different brain regions actually impinge on or affect these GnRH producing neurons. Notice here, emotions can alter the secretion of these different hormones, which is really, really important. Hormone levels and balance can be seriously affected by stress and emotion. Okay, so stressors, various biological, physiological, emotional stressors can increase corticotropin releasing hormone production. So that is the hormone that is produced by the hypothalamus that triggers the release of stress hormones from the adrenal glands. All of these are sort of acting through the hypothalamus, higher brain centers that are ultimately reaching the hypothalamus and affecting the endocrine system or release of key hormones. And also circadian rhythms. A lot of brain regions, including emotional aspects of stimuli in the brain, can ultimately affect circadian rhythms. And we'll look at exactly how they do that. But they affect key structures in the brain, specifically the pineal gland, and we'll talk about that. I'll go through that in just a minute. All right, so I'm just going to stop here for just a second. I know this is a lot of information. The endocrine system is a lot of information. It's pretty dense. It's super fascinating, and I think a lot of people have a lot of fascination with hormones and how they act. And we've been working them out for decades, and now know so much about the various hormones and their actions. But the good thing about this video is you can pause it, stop it, rewind it, take breaks whenever you want. So you can break it up as needed and review it back and forth as needed. So the pancreas, this is a really important endocrine gland, and this is going to be related to blood sugar regulation and involved in the tests that we're going to be doing on Thursday in lab. And remember, regardless of power outage, we're going to have lab because we don't need electricity for these tests. They're very simple handheld glucometers that are just battery operated, so it's really easy for us to do. And hopefully we'll have our at least 4 subject volunteers. I already have a couple, but hopefully we have all of them that are willing to fast and be a part of the glucose tolerance test that we're doing on Thursday. So the pancreas is very, very cool because it is both, it's like a 2-for-1. It is both an endocrine, so it makes hormones, and an exocrine gland. Exocrine meaning it makes enzymes that are involved in digestion in this case. So it makes digestive enzymes that it dumps into your gut, allows you to break down food, all those macromolecules that we've talked about. And it's endocrine, so it makes key hormones that regulate homeostasis in your body. So the endocrine part of the pancreas are located in what we call the islets of Langerhans, which means the islands of Langerhans for the anatomist who discovered them. And if you look, they actually stain a little bit lighter. They're kind of pink in color instead of dark purple. And they make these little clusters or islands of cells. All the circles represent the nuclei. Individual nucleus of each individual cell is all throughout here. And there's about 1 million in your pancreas. The key is in these islets, there's alpha cells and there's beta cells. Okay, so there's two different kind of there's three actually different types of cells, but we're just going to focus on the alpha cells. These are the ones that make the hormone glucagon. Okay, hold on to that for just a second. The beta cells are the ones that make insulin. Now, I'm pretty sure all of you have heard of insulin. In this day and age, almost everybody has heard of the insulin, especially because its dysfunction and role in diabetes. But many of you have probably not heard about glucagon, and I would like to emphasize that both of these are really equally important in terms of regulating blood sugar levels and keeping your system in balance or in homeostasis. Pancreas, just to show you, is this organ that's tucked. The stomach would be right in front here. The pancreas, this is kind of leaf-shaped structure where it's broader here and it has a tail that gets out and gets pretty thin. But all of these cells here, and here's a cluster showing one of these islets of Langerhans, where there's alpha cells and beta cells that make those two major hormones, glucagon and insulin. These are spread, interspersed all throughout the pancreatic tissue. And these hormones are made and then dumped into blood vessels, capillaries that carry them out through the whole body into the bloodstream. And so all of your cells and tissues get exposed to either glucagon or insulin, depending on the stimuli. The pancreas also makes a series of digestive enzymes, about over 20 different digestive enzymes through its different cells, its exocrine cells. And it makes those digestive enzymes and dumps them into these ducts, the pancreatic duct, which ultimately dumps into the first part of your small intestine, which is known as the duodenum or the duodenum, however you want to say it. The stomach actually was removed, so it would attach to the small intestine right here. Here's the stomach. So where food contents first start churning and getting turned down into sort of fluid, and then they enter here. So the pancreas is involved in secreting digestive enzymes into the small intestine and mediating digestion processes. And it's also involved with these specialized cells or these islets of making hormones that regulate blood sugar. Okay, so insulin is really the main hormone that regulates plasma glucose concentration. So your blood plasma glucose concentration should normally be in a range of about 60 to 110 milligrams per deciliter. This is kind of the normal range of sugar in your blood. Insulin is secreted by the beta cells when blood glucose levels rise after a sugary carbohydrate meal. So after you have a meal, and especially one that has carbohydrates in it, and almost all meals will have some amount of carbohydrates in them, that will trigger your beta cells, your pancreas, to start dumping out the insulin that they've made and stored. So the role of insulin is really to lower blood glucose levels to the normal range, and it allows cells to take up this glucose, okay? So carbohydrate meal is taken in. This stimulates the pancreas, specifically the beta cells, to start dumping out insulin. Insulin serves to allow cells to start sucking up glucose into the cells, and thereby this lowers blood glucose levels into the normal range. Because after you eat a meal, it actually spikes up, your blood sugar spikes up higher than this. Insulin is what allows your blood sugar levels to come back down to the normal range. So what's the normal range? So I want you to sort of know this value, and we're going to explore it more in lab, but it's 60 to 110 milligrams per deciliter of glucose in the blood. So insulin actually binds to receptors on target cells. So there are vesicles inside of your cells that have glucose transporter proteins in them, and they fuse with the membrane when they get the response from insulin. Okay, so insulin is a peptide or a protein hormone, so it acts on receptors that are on the plasma membrane of target cells. So this whole process, that receptor activates a signal transduction pathway where glucose transporters get inserted into the membrane. So basically through exocytosis, but they're stuck in the membrane. So now you have glucose carriers or transporters in the cell membranes. So glucose can then diffuse through the transporters, the glucose transporters, by facilitated diffusion. So this takes us back to membrane transport mechanisms. What is facilitated diffusion? Okay. And I want you to kind of think about that for a second. And then in adipose tissue, so in fat tissue and in skeletal muscle and in the liver, this is where this process happens, where insulin binds to its receptor and it triggers the insertion of glucose transporters into the membrane so that these cells can draw in or take in glucose by facilitated diffusion. And this insulin actually indirectly stimulates the liver and also your skeletal muscles, all the voluntary muscles of your body, to promote sugar storage. So it has them take in the sugar and then produce glycogen, or put that sugar together into its polymer known as glycogen, which we spent time on in the beginning of the course talking about macromolecules. That process of sugar storage, stimulating the liver and the muscles to store that free glucose that they've now taken into the cells and store them in the form of glycogen, is called glycogenesis. So the production or birth of glycogen. Glycogenesis is the creation of more glycogen. This makes sense. If glucose levels are high, like after a carbohydrate meal, insulin goes up, allows the cells to take in the glucose. Now that you have enough, it's telling the cells store that glucose in the form of glycogen. So insulin also stimulates your fat cells, your adipocytes, to store fat. So to actually start storing fat that's available. Fatty acids get packaged into triglycerides, and then they get stored in the adipose cells. This process is called lipogenesis, the birth or production of lipids, lipo. So store fat, store sugar polymers, so you have them for a rainy day. Sugar goes up, insulin goes up, allows the cells to take in the glucose and store them as glycogen, and also cause your fat cells to start storing more fat. Here's a nice little figure just depicting how insulin acts, because I like to see these visual instead of just a bunch of words. It's good to look at what they visually look like. So the insulin gets secreted in response to carbohydrates in the blood. Those beta cells start dumping out a bunch of insulin. Insulin travels through the blood from the pancreas, and it acts on target cells like adipose, like skeletal muscle, like liver cells. It acts on its receptor. That triggers a whole cascade of events. So a bunch of proteins get activated and triggered to carry on that signal downstream. Ultimately, all I want you to know is kind of the beginning and the end. This triggers the insertion of glucose transporters. In this case, they're known as GLUT4 transporters that are in the vesicles, okay, in these special vesicles. This triggers the insertion of these vesicles by exocytosis up into the plasma membrane. So they actually fuse by exocytosis. These glucose transporters fuse into the membrane. So now you have these little glucose carriers or glucose transporters that are known as GLUTs, not your butt, your gluteus maximus, but GLUTs, as in glucose transporters, GLUT4. GLUT4 is a common one, or one of the main ones. Now these GLUTs are in the membrane, and so glucose can actually enter and go through the cells. It's high in the blood plasma and the interstitial fluids, and so it can go right down its concentration gradient into the cells of your body, like your skeletal muscles and your liver and your fat cells. Okay, so insulin acts when it's present in the blood. It acts on its receptor, triggers a whole cascade of events that allow the insertion of the glucose transporters into the plasma membrane by exocytosis. Now you've got a lot of glucose transporters, so now the cells can actually suck in and take in a bunch of sugar. So now think about this for just a second. Insulin allows cells to take up glucose, specifically skeletal muscle and liver cells. Okay, your brain doesn't need this. Your brain actually has glucose transporters always in the membrane, so it can take in plenty of glucose every minute of every day. But your skeletal and liver cells, they actually insert through this receptor process through insulin. So now, if there's carriers, if there's glucose transporters in the membrane, this will actually work to lower blood glucose levels as the cells are taking in more glucose. So insulin lowers blood sugar levels exactly by this mechanism in the cells of your body. Okay, So glucagon, this is the other hormone that I mentioned that many of you may not have heard of before, whereas you've probably heard of insulin. You probably didn't know about the little black sheep, glucagon. Okay, but glucagon actually is a really cool hormone. It's very important. It is antagonistic to insulin. That means it acts against insulin. It does exactly the opposite of what insulin does. So it's secreted by those alpha cells in those islets of Langerhans in the pancreas when blood glucose levels are low. So when you are fasting or you haven't eaten for a long time, you end up having glucagon getting secreted by those alpha cells. So sugar is low, they are triggered to start dumping out their glucagon hormones. So the role of glucagon hormone is to raise blood glucose levels back to the normal range. So when blood glucose levels get low, this is bad, this can be dangerous. If they go too low, if you get below 60 milligrams per deciliter into the 50, 40, that risks the situation of coma and even death if your blood sugar levels go that low. It can cause seizures, cognitive problems, fatigue, lethargy. Eventually, it can lead to coma and death if your sugar levels drop that low. So glucagon is really poised and ready for when they start dropping too low. Glucagon gets dumped out and it helps to raise it back up to normal. Now remember, what is the normal range? 60 to about 110 milligrams per deciliter. Okay, so the action of glucagon. It does a bunch of really great things. It stimulates, now this is a crazy word, but it's sort of a simple process here. It stimulates glycogenolysis. Lysis refers to breaking. Glycogen. So this is glycogen breaking, which makes sense, right? Glycogen is the polymer of glucose. Insulin triggered the storage of lots of glycogen. Well, now when your sugar is low, glycogen actually tells your liver, break down that glycogen in glycogenolysis and free all that glucose into the blood so that we can raise blood sugar levels. It also stimulates gluconeogenesis. This is a fancy word for basically just making new glucose using non-carbohydrates like amino acids and fatty acids and turning them into glucose. And we can do that. Lots of different tissues like your liver can actually do that. So glucagon stimulates gluconeogenesis. This means new, okay, I'm going to reverse it, Latin. The birth of new glucose. You see that? The production or birth of new glucose, gluconeogenesis. This is saying, hey, use some of the fats, use the fatty acids, use some of those proteins, convert those into glucose because the brain needs glucose. So your body will do this repeatedly when your blood sugar levels start to dip. Glucagon also stimulates lipolysis. Okay, so lipolysis. Remember, the other one is lipogenesis. That's the production of new fats in the adipose cells. This is the opposite. This is the lysis, or the breaking down of lipids. Okay, so this is adipose tissue is breaking down triglycerides into fatty acids so the fatty acids can be released and used as fuel instead of using glucose. Okay, so some of the tissues that need glucose, like the brain, neurons of the brain and the spinal cord, they can use glucose. And then other tissues like your skeletal muscles can really just rely heavily on fats like fatty acids. Okay, so all of this is serving to increase blood levels of glucose. Okay, so to bring glucose levels back up. All of them increase glucose and fats or fatty acids in the blood. So when you're fasting and you haven't had food for many hours, glucagon is being secreted and it's regulating things. It's saying, no, let's just make sure glucose stays at a good range, stays up high enough, it doesn't dip down too low, and that we have fatty acids circulating in the blood and we can use those as fuels while we're in this fasting mode. This gives us sort of a summary overview of glucose homeostasis. So the balance of insulin and glucagon in how they control blood sugar levels. Okay, so we've got blood. If we have high sugar in the plasma after a carbohydrate containing meal, this will stimulate the alpha and beta cells. The beta cells specifically will start dumping out lots of insulin. The alpha cells will stop releasing glucagon. Okay, so these two are antagonistic. One goes up, the other goes down. You have lots of insulin circulating in the blood. This triggers the cellular uptake of glucose and the utilization of that glucose. This serves to decrease glucose in your blood plasma. So sugar levels go down. Notice you started with high sugar in the blood, ended with low sugar in the blood. So insulin, through this pathway, it's kind of a negative feedback pathway, lowers blood sugar levels and allows cells to take up and use glucose. Now the opposite is true. So this is a fed state. This is a fasted state. When you're fasting, your sugar levels are going to be lower in your blood plasma. This triggers the alpha cells specifically to start releasing lots of quantities of glucagon, and the beta cells to stop releasing insulin. Again, antagonistic hormones doing two different things. In this case, glucagon is predominating, and it goes down and tells many tissues and cells of your body, all right, don't take up glucose, leave it in the blood, do not take it up. And actually, let's start breaking down the glycogen stores in the liver and the skeletal muscles. Free up that glucose so we can put it into the blood. And actually, some of these other things like fatty acids and proteins, let's turn those into glucose because we need more sugar in the blood. It's dropping too much. So all of these serve to increase blood levels of glucose. So the glucose levels come up. Again, glucose was down through the process of glucagon and all these physiological pathways. It brings it back up in the blood. So both of these serve to regulate in a homeostatic sort of balance blood sugar levels, showing how important it is that, again, another one of these parameters, we talked a lot about pH of the body fluids and of the blood. Now this is sugar levels in the blood. Very important that you stay in this sort of range of what's physiologically normal. And if you get too far out of that range, it indicates disease and problems. Okay, so these hormones, glucagon and insulin are really important in regulating sugar levels in the blood. And as we're going to do in lab this Thursday, we're going to detect and look at glucose levels in the blood using a glucose tolerance test, or it's called an OGTT, an oral glucose tolerance test. And this is really used to detect things like diabetes, when sugar levels go up really, really high, way above the normal concentrations in the blood. Here's a non-diabetic, starting at about 70 milligrams per deciliter, goes up to about 150, and then over a period of an hour to 2 hours, it gets clear and it goes back down, actually a little bit lower even than when it started, sugar levels. In someone that is pre-diabetic, it would be a little bit higher than that, and so closer, kind of intermediate between normal and diabetic. And then someone that's straight has diabetes mellitus, their sugar levels at rest or fasting are going to be above 100, and their values often go up to above 250 in peak blood sugar levels and clear, and they don't actually get down to sort of baseline levels. So the take-home point is that they overall have higher resting or fasting blood glucose levels, and they go up very, very high after consuming glucose or carbohydrate, okay? And this is actually from the point the glucose is given is right here. This is time zero. So in our lab test, we're going to do time zero, 30 minutes, 60, 90, 120, 150. So we're going to actually look at these exact curves in all the subjects that are volunteering for the glucose tolerance test. Diabetes mellitus is caused by insufficient secretion of insulin or resistance of the body cells to insulin. So these are two different types of diabetes. And as you can guess, one is caused or called diabetes type 1, and the other one is diabetes type 2. So in type 1 diabetes, this develops usually suddenly and usually less than 15 years of age, so young, typically in the preteen or teen years, or even earlier it's detected. It's mediated by T cells or lymphocytes, white blood cells, that actually start triggering the production. They start making antibodies and they start destroying the person's own pancreatic beta cells. So the beta cells of the islets of Langerhans are triggered to be attacked and broken down by the person's lymphocytes, their own white blood cells. So this destroys those cells and basically they produce no insulin. Okay, so you can imagine if they have no insulin, they cannot regulate their blood sugar levels. They can't get blood sugars levels to go back down into the normal range. So they stay high. Type 2 diabetes is different in onset. Okay, it used to be called adult onset. However, now it's totally prevalent in children, in teenagers of various ages. Okay, usually it occurs detected, and it occurs around 40 years or older. So in middle age, it's much more common, this type 2 diabetes. I want you to think about what it is associated with. So what is type 2 diabetes mellitus typically associated with or go hand in hand with? And then part of the etiology or the cause for this type 2 diabetes, or the reason it's occurring in the body, is the body has a decreased sensitivity to insulin. So it's not that insulin is not being produced or that the beta cells are destroyed like in type 1, but it's because the cells of the body, the skeletal muscle cells, the fat cells, the liver cells, those cells are no longer sensitive to insulin, or they have a receptor to insulin. Their receptors are not as responsive. They have become desensitized. And if you think about it, usually this is associated with diet and a lot of carbohydrate kind of overload throughout life. So the carbohydrates causing the release of insulin, and then insulin acting on its receptor over and over and over and over. And if it's too much, it actually causes those receptors to sort of malfunction. They get desensitized and they no longer respond to insulin, which is a really bad situation because then you cannot regulate your blood sugar levels and bring glucose down into normal, healthy ranges. So typically type 2 diabetes can be controlled by dietary changes and regular exercise. And in fact, they found the most beneficial effects were regular exercise and just cutting out a lot of sugary, fatty things in the diet. So things like hamburgers, sodas, all those that are really, really high in the SOFAs, the added fats and sugars, makes a huge difference. So type 2 diabetes is actually reversible, especially if you catch it in the beginning phases. This, with changing diet, nutrition, and exercise, can reverse the symptoms and prevent having type 2 diabetes. Whereas type 1, the individuals, there's nothing they can really do about it. Their body is not producing insulin because their lymphocytes, their immune system destroyed them. So they have to actually take recombinant insulin. So they need to be maintaining their blood sugar levels and then taking insulin throughout the day because they do not have the hormone that allows blood sugar levels to be lowered with insulin. So type 1, they medically need insulin. Type 2, there are medicines to treat it if the individual cannot control it with dietary changes and exercise. There are additional medicines that help to sort of sensitize the body to insulin. So those are the two different major types of these blood sugar regulation diseases or diabetes mellitus. This is a table that does an overview of what are the features of type 1 diabetes and the features of type 2. Overall, the ages of people that are affected, as I went over, the development, the percentage of the diabetic population. So the majority of the diabetic population, notice, is type 2 diabetes, not type 1, the one that is an effect of immune dysfunction. So this is very, very rare, much more rare than type 2. Also ketoacidosis, or the production of ketones, which results from the breakdown of a lot of fats and fatty acids. So the body is primarily shifting to fat metabolism and creating ketones, which are acids. Remember, that drops the blood pH. It's very common in type 1 diabetes because they have such a severe situation of no insulin and switching to fat metabolism. Association with obesity, notice that it's very common with type 2, not common in type 1. Also, the beta cells of the islets are destroyed in type 1. They're totally fine in type 2. Insulin secretion is decreased or absent in type 1, and it's normal or increased in type 2. Remember, it's the insulin receptors that are desensitized, not the production and secretion of insulin itself. Okay, and the treatment, of course, type 1, they need insulin. They need insulin injections. And then type 2, typically it's diet and exercise, as I said, or oral stimulators of insulin sensitivity to make those cell receptors more sensitive to the hormone insulin. Okay, I think I'm going to stop. I'm going to stop this video lecture capture just so I can make it more in bite sizes. I'm going to stop it right here and resume it in a second lecture capture in just a few minutes. So yeah, I'll stop right there.